So our first presenter, Dr. Kenneth Pargament, is our leadoff hitter, actually, to use the baseball analogy, the perfect leadoff hitter for this topic, because Ken has really been a seminal figure in spiritually integrated psychotherapy, in the field of psychology of religion. I would really put it this way, that if you think back to those of you, again, who can have this historical perspective, to the 1980s and 90s, where the questions of spirituality and religion and psychology were highly contested, there's probably, I would say, a couple of people responsible for changing the whole narrative. And really, Ken is one of the most influential in reshaping the psychology of religion in the broader field, developing a huge empirical base to show that religious coping and religious health are a part of many people's lives, and sort of changing that perspective. Ken has over 300 publications. He's edited the APA Handbook of Psychology, Religion, and Spirituality as the chief editor in collaboration with others. His key volumes on religious coping and spiritually integrative psychotherapy are classic texts, widely read. I've always been impressed that Ken, with his amazing scholarly productivity, has continued to do clinical work throughout your career, which is wonderful integration. And Ken is someone who also in the field has found a way to invite people to be aware of different religious and spiritual traditions. At a time when initially the research, I think, tended to, back in the 90s, perhaps still take a rather thin approach, the least common denominator about spirituality and religion. Ken, and through his students and his own respect for diversity, has helped the field become more cognizant of diversity. So very grateful to have you here, Ken, to share with us. Thank you.
Thank you, Steve, for that very nice introduction. I'm really honored to be here on this special occasion. And it's a bit of a homecoming for me, because I spent a number of years here at the end of the 1990s, the beginning of the 21st century at the Danielson. Great fortune to work and collaborate with some wonderful people, and Nancy Dever, Carabon, Carrie Doring, among others, and I did have some really memorable conversations with Merle Jordan as well, and I certainly remember that and appreciate that. I also want to thank Steve and Brad and George for putting this conference together. I know how much can go into this whole process, so I'm very grateful that you had this really exciting idea. And I'm really, really looking forward to me finishing my talk so I can get down to the real business of listening to the other talks and exchanging with people. And I also want to acknowledge a few people who've been my lifeline, my collaborators over the years. I think the work in this area, spirituality and religion, there's such rich, complex, emotionally charged topics that no single person, I think, is sufficient unto him or herself to approach this topic. This cries for collaboration, this work, cries for relational ecology. And I've been really so fortunate over the years to have wonderful collaborators, colleagues, graduate students, and these are just some of the faces. One of them is sitting here right now, Serena Wong, a graduate student at BGSU and in clinical psychology, and a wonderful collaborator as well. And one other story I just wanted to share with you about the Danielson. I was just reflecting on this as we were talking about. I think that the Danielson, for me, is first and foremost about a kind of caring, compassionate community. The example I'll give you is, and I hope I don't embarrass you too much, Nancy, but when I was here at the Danielson, my mother had developed pancreatic cancer. And so she was having surgery at one of the hospitals at Harvard. And she was up here with my father, but alone, except for my family coming up from Washington, D.C. or Baltimore to visit. But she was largely just the two of them. I don't know how Nancy heard about that, but unbeknownst to me, she went out to visit them. And my mother just said, "That was such a nice lady." I said, "Yeah, that's Nancy." So that to me is the Danielson, that kind of act of compassion. I'll always remember that, Nancy. Thank you. Okay, this is the first time I've ever given a talk that has the words reflection in it. I'm not sure what that really says, but I thought this is a wonderful opportunity to be able to reflect at this time of life as an aging psychologist. The latter years are really appropriate for that, taking a step back and reflecting on yourself, your work, at the state of the field. It's not a bad idea to do that when you're younger, too, but I've enjoyed the chance to do that now. And I'd like to reflect in this paper and talk how my own approach to spiritually integrated therapy has been shaped by my own identity as a Jew, and how it's been shaped as well by my encounters with other faiths. This is a reflection I've never done before publicly. So what I'm doing is, it's not to say my faith and interactions with other traditions aren't deeply embedded in the way I think about and approach people. It's just, I've never talked about it. So this is new, this is different, and apologize for any bumps and the unfinished nature of it, but I just want to share some of these thoughts with you. If you have any problems with what I'm saying, please blame the conference planners. Okay? Real quickly, a few assumptions underlying what I'm going to be talking about is that, and I think we're all pretty much on board here, value neutrality in therapy is completely impossible. I like the way Stanton Jones from Wheaton College put it. He said, "One can't intervene in the fabric of human life without getting deeply involved in moral and spiritual matters." So the idea that the therapist can be a tabula rasa, totally neutral, it's not feasible. And as early as 1980, Alan Bergen, a real father figure to this field, warned us that in the effort to remain completely detached, we're likely to become hidden or subtle persuaders. He kind of turned things around and said that being more explicit, in careful ways, he would say, but being more explicit about our own worldviews offers an important corrective to that potential for becoming hidden persuaders. The second assumption that I want to make is that something I think we're all aware of, the world's becoming increasingly pluralistic religiously. This is a statement that I think captured it in 1991 by Anderson and Hopkins, but I believe it's even more true today. They wrote, "Here, the US, Hindu yogas teach next door to South American shamans, and Congregationalist churches share their space with Buddhist and Taoist communities. Jewish men and women become Zen masters, and Catholic priests learn Japanese forms of meditation and purification." Okay. As a result, it's a misnomer to speak in terms of the Protestant, the Catholic, the Jewish, the Hindu, the Muslim, the Buddhist, or even the atheist client. There's such tremendous diversity within them. People have become much more spiritually eclectic, what Reginald Bibby described as religion a la carte, picking and choosing from your choice of menu options, beliefs and practices. And this leads to the third assumption, and that psychotherapy is in essence a meeting of worlds. It's a meeting of worlds, the clients and the therapists. And to conduct effective therapy in this meeting, therapists have to learn about and respond to the distinctive religious world of the client, while remaining well aware of the worlds that we bring to the therapy process, and how our own worldviews may shape the therapeutic encounter in desirable or undesirable ways. So with these assumptions in mind, let me begin by providing a little background on myself as a Jewish psychologist of religion. Again, this is all new for me, so here we go. From my earliest years, I knew that I was Jewish, but I didn't realize that I was really Jewish until I was in my 20s. I was born and raised in a conservative Jewish community in Washington, D.C. And like most of my Jewish friends, much of my education in Judaism was geared to preparing for my rite of passage into adulthood, my bar mitzvah. at the ripe old age of 13. That's not me. But it's kind of like me. I wouldn't have been smiling. I was much too nervous. I did okay at my bar mitzvah, I was told, except I started way too high and when I was starting to read from the Torah, and so I had to I changed my tone completely in the middle of it. But when I completed it, like most of my friends, I stopped with my Jewish education. And don't get me wrong, I didn't stop feeling Jewish. I continued to feel deeply Jewish and continue to feel deeply Jewish, but I didn't know why. In my 20s, I read a book that impacted me a lot. It's by Irving Howe, and it was written in 1976, called World of Our Fathers, The Journey of the East European Jews to America and the Life They Found and Made. And I'm a grandchild of immigrants from Eastern Europe. And as the title conveys, the book presents stories of Jews in the immigration process in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. And listening to these stories, I experienced myself. I was shocked. I experienced myself in the vigilance, the hypervigilance to a world that could come crashing down on them at any time. I experienced myself in their belief and sense of a flawed and broken universe and world that's desperately in need of repair. I experienced myself in a world that loves deep thinking about questions that are so meaningful to me, why we're here, how we should live our lives. And I experienced myself in the sense of humor that absolutely refuses to let suffering and tragedy have the last word. These are just some descriptions of that. I like that cartoon. If it's this rabbi contemplating, if I worry, therefore I am. If Descartes had been Jewish. Another Jewish joke I have to tell you, one of my favorites. So two Jews had been condemned to death in a Russian gulag. Before they're about to be shot, their guard and executioner asks them if they have a final request. Do they want and he says, I'll give you a final cigarette. And one accepts a cigarette, but the other says, I don't smoke. And the one who accepts admonishes his friend. He says, take the cigarette, Moishi, don't make trouble. I find that really hilarious. This may be the test of, do I have any Jewish blood in my background? All of these made me realize that I'm Jewish in a way that goes well beyond attending synagogue, following the commandments, or even believing in God. It was just interwoven in my personality, my worldview, my character, my sense of humor. And this was a starting point for me, and I became very curious about learning more about how my own faith was interwoven in my life and how it might be interwoven in the lives of other people. And at the same time going through this, I was in graduate school in psychology, figuring out what I wanted to do with that. And I thought psychology was the place to help people deal with the big questions. Why are we here in this world? What makes for a meaningful life? What makes us tick? How do we make the world a better place? And I only semi-joke that my first client was a 3-pound pigeon. I called him Walter. Those of you who know about old movie stars, Walter Pigeon. I met and cared for Walter, and I learned a lot about operant conditioning principles, principles of reinforcement and punishment, and it was great. I mean, all this knowledge came in handy in dealing with different kinds of problems, people with learning disabilities, children who are behavioral problems. But when it came to the big questions that drew me into the field, why are we here? How do we make the world a better place? Walter had very little to say. He didn't have much to teach me about that. And I found that the other paradigms of the time, the psychodynamic paradigm, some of the people who were teaching me that I thought were pretty depressed people, very dark. And I wondered, how can you be helpful to people when you're kind of trapped in the same darkness that they are? So I started looking outside and wondered whether religious thought and practice might have something to offer psychology, a way to deepen psychology. I didn't agree with many of the answers that I was reading about in books on theology and the religions of the world, but what I appreciated was they were dealing with the same questions. Why are we here? What is it all about? How should we live our lives? How do we make the world a better place? So I took the radical step of beginning to go to churches and temples and mosques and talk to people. And that's what I was most interested in, talking to people about how their religion was involved in their lives, particularly in the concrete, pivotal times of their lives: life, death, illness, transition. What role did it play? It was a little scary. I didn't know how I would be received as a Jewish guy walking into a church, but I was welcomed. I think there was some implicit agenda of trying to win me over and convert me, but I was welcomed, and I learned a lot. And as I was doing this, I was learning also that the field of psychology was not really happy with religion, and they weren't real fans of this kind of work. From Freud to Skinner, there's some really not so implicit biases against religious life. But I felt, and continue to feel, that there are important gains to be made when we begin to bridge the worlds of religion and psychology, and that we can enhance our effectiveness as mental health professionals by integrating the distinctive resources of various religions into treatment. That integration and bridging with religion isn't just a matter of encouraging religious communities to refer to psychologists and social workers, that in fact religious communities have something to teach us as mental health providers. It's a two-way learning process. And so spiritually integrated therapy, the way I think of it, rests on that premise that we can draw from the fruits of many religious traditions. So with that introduction in mind, let me tell you what I would like to talk about in this time I have. I'd like to talk about, again, explicitly how I've harvested two fruits of Judaism in my own writings and thinking and research. Then I'd like to talk about how I've harvested one or two fruits from other religious traditions, how I've gained from my experience and knowledge of other religious traditions in my clinical work. And then finally talk about what does this mean for how do we work together with clients who are different from us, which is basically everyone, and how do we work when our clients come to us from different traditions? What role and responsibility do we have if we are from a particular tradition ourselves? What are some of the challenges that we face in working with clients with this perspective in mind, that in respectful ways, but also ways that also help us appreciate diversity and the richness of religious traditions? Okay, so the first fruit I want to talk about that I plucked from Judaism is sanctification. And let me quickly say that even though I plucked it or harvested it from Judaism, it's not distinctive to Judaism. We can find this from it grows on other religious trees. By the time I'm finished with this, you're going to hate this metaphor. In fact, my collaborator on much of this work on sanctification, Annette Mahoney, is a Christian psychologist. So we define sanctification as a process of perceiving seemingly ordinary aspects of life as reflective of God or higher powers and or possessing extraordinary or divine qualities. Let me try to make the implicit more explicit here as I talk about sanctification. And at the risk of overgeneralizing, I'd say that in comparison to many other religious traditions, Judaism is less concerned about direct encounters with God. In fact, I don't have any data on it, but I'd bet that Jews report fewer personal experiences with the divine than Christians, for instance. In the Hebrew Bible, God tells Moses to warn the Jewish people not to gaze directly at the Lord, lest many of them perish. The idea of that direct confrontation or meeting with God is just not something you hear a lot about or people talk a lot about within Judaism. Within Judaism, it's more common to have what Peter Berger once called signals of transcendence, intimations of God's presence. Yeah, intimations of something otherworldly in this world. Judaism is very concerned with the connection between heaven and earth, that point of connection between heaven and earth. It teaches that a divine presence can be found in everyday life, and in fact, we're told to look for it. And how do we do that? One way is through prayer. This is part of the prayer in Jewish services every morning and every evening. It's a central part to me. Kadosh, 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 Adonai Tzvaot, Malo Kol Haaretz Kavodo. Holy, holy, holy is the Lord of hosts. And this key part, the whole world is filled with his glory. The idea that there's a kind of emanation from God that finds its way into the world, from heaven to earth. So partly through prayer, partly through treating life as sacred. And in Judaism, this is a commandment, to treat life as sacred. The commandments, all 613 of them, aren't legalisms. They're about how do we go about, in great detail, how do we go about treating who we are, who other people are, how we work, how we rest, how we treat animals, how we treat family, even how we treat enemies. How do we treat people as carrying, and the world as carrying a spark of the divine? And a third way within Judaism is through rituals, the simple acts of lighting candles, eating a special meal, a ritual drink of wine, or sharing of challah. We're encouraged to see the world in a new light. The transition rituals, bar and bat mitzvah, weddings, circumcisions, funerals, these are more than opportunities for gift-giving and celebration. They're rites of passage, what Edwin Friedman once wrote, hinges of time, when something is revealed to have a deeper connection, where you start to see life in depth, because these are such important periods. In short, Jews are called upon to make sacred, sanctify the world, see the world through a sacred lens. And so my interest in this topic, I think, came to me from that subterranean place, even though I never put that together. And none of my writings on sanctification makes any mention of my own background in this area and why I found it so compelling. But again, I want to stress that this is not exclusive to Judaism. And so I was interested in harvesting this fruit, but I didn't want to make any claims about exclusivism. And so I'm very interested in finding signs of sanctification in other traditions, and they're not hard to find. Within Hinduism, in the Upanishads, this scripture, filled with Brahman are the things we see, filled with Brahman are the things we see not. From out of Brahman floweth all that is, from Brahman all, yet he is still the same. From heaven to earth. Within Christianity, from Corinthians, there are varieties of gifts, but the same Spirit, varieties of services, but the same Lord. And it's the same God who inspires them all and everyone. I'll skip this one. And I love this quote, one of my very favorites, by the Protestant Frederick Beckner, minister and beautiful writer. And he talks about how life itself, all of it can be sanctified. I think most of us tend to see the sacred in particular areas of life and would have a hard time of seeing everything is sacred. There's too much trouble in the world and annoying people and annoying situations to see everything is sacred. But he says, the last part is the key. He says, listen to your life, see it for the fathomless mystery that it is, in the boredom and in the pain of it, no less than the excitement and gladness. Touch and taste your way to the holy and hidden heart of it, because in the last analysis, all moments are key moments, and life itself. I want to add that the process of sanctification can also be experienced by atheists. They too can imbue aspects of life with divine qualities often associated with God, like transcendence, boundlessness, ultimacy. And here's an example, the words of a Swedish atheist. She has cancer, and she's talking about the experience of sacredness she has in nature. This is from Fereshte Amadi. She has a book out on her interviews with these patients. And this woman says, whatever happens in the world for me or others, nature is still there. It keeps going. It's a feeling of security when everything else is chaos. The leaves fall off, new ones appear. Somewhere there's a pulse that keeps going. It's a feeling, if we can use this word without connecting it to God. That's what I feel in nature. Well, yeah, you can have the feeling and not connect it to God. You can experience something extraordinary without necessarily believing in God. You can experience a sense of being in touch with some ultimate reality or truth without believing in God, or a sense of something timeless in the universe, the pulse that continues to beat through nature. And so we're doing some research right now on this whole notion of the experiences of sacredness of atheists. Again, I'm trying to underscore how this is not a weird or unusual kind of concept. I had some psychologists comment on this has to be unusual and maybe it's something related to psychosis. No. This is a study that Carrie Doring did with our group and Ann Clark in 2002, a national survey. And so these are items like, I see evidence of God in nature and creation, okay? Sanctification item. 78% of people in the US endorse that. I experience something more sacred in life than simply material existence. I go beyond the surface and see a deeper level of truth. 76% endorse it. I see God's presence in all of life. 75% of Americans endorse that. So sanctification is not something that's rare or unusual. A number of studies have shown, we've been studying it for years, a number of studies have shown it's got important implications for our lives. First, the sacred becomes whatever we hold sacred, and we hold different things sacred. That's one of the things that distinguish people from each other. The sacred is a magnet. It draws us forward. It's a motivating force. It propels us. It's a source of meaning, pushes us forward in life. Several years ago, I saw a 45-year-old woman in therapy who had come to me after being diagnosed with glioblastoma, malignant brain tumor, and she was given 2 more years of life, according to her physicians. And in the initial session, I asked what she might like to accomplish in therapy. And she said, well, what matters, and then I asked her, well, what matters most to you? What do you hold sacred? And she said to me, she said, my children are sacred to me. And now, my client is a Jewish woman. She was the mother of 4 boys. And she said she wanted to be present for her youngest son's bar mitzvah. Now, her youngest son was 9 years old. So that's 4 years away, and her physicians had given her 2 years. And so she asked for my help in coping with the difficult treatments that she was about to go through, and just the ordeal of the treatment. And that's what we did. It was very onerous, but I believe that having that sacred mission, that sacred goal, destination, is what helped keep her going. And she lived to see her youngest son bar mitzvah, and she almost lived to see him graduate high school. One of the longest, longest survival of anyone with glioblastoma that had been heard of there. And it brought to mind Viktor Frankl's statement, people who have a why to live for can deal with almost any how. Second, we're motivated to try to preserve and protect what's sacred to us. So if it's sacred, we try to care for it. And Annette Mahoney and her colleagues did a study on this of college students, where the students were asked the degree to which they see their bodies as sacred. Then looked at health practices. And students who saw their bodies as sacred took better care of their bodies. And these are just some indications of how they did do that. Then the sacred becomes a precious object, a resource that we draw on for health and well-being. few years ago, I was teaching a small graduate seminar, and I asked my graduate students to bring in a sacred object, something that of deep value and meaning to them. And I remember one of my students brought in she didn't have to bring it in. She was wearing an amulet, a small amulet, and she just took it out. People said, "Oh, that's beautiful." And then she said, "This contains some of my father's ashes." Her father had died when she was 11. And so it's sacred to her. She's able to carry her father close to her heart through that sacred object. And it's something that she could hold on to, literally, and feel close to her heart in difficult times. The flip side of all of this is that the inability to perceive or experience something sacred may be problematic for people. This is from Harold Kushner, who describes a world without the sacred. He says it would be a flat, monochromatic world, a world without color or texture, a world in which all days would be the same. Marriage would be a matter of biology, not fidelity. Old age would be seen as a time of weakness, not of wisdom. In a world like that, we would cast about desperately for any sort of diversion, for any distraction from the emptiness of our lives, because we would never have learned the magic of making some days and hours special. I think this work on sanctification has wonderful implications and applications for therapy. Simply asking people, what do you hold sacred, is a powerful question. It's not the same as asking, so tell me, what do you find important in your life? Right? What matters to you? No, the sacred language resonates much more deeply with people. And if we're willing to ask the question, it opens up the conversation in therapy to a whole deeper level of discussion. What really matters, the really, is what's key in this. Actually, I'll mention this. When I was here at the Danielson, worked with Brian McCorkle and his colleagues and people at the Center for Anxiety Disorders here with David Barlow. And we were working with people with social anxiety disorder, and we conceptualized social anxiety as, in part, using the Gestalt illusion, getting lost in the foreground of a picture. With social anxiety, all you experience is the social anxiety, and it swamps everything else, so you can't see anything but your anxiety. I mean, that's the nature of social panic. What we tried to do in this brief group program was to help people begin to see the object with the background in mind, to be able to see the background that, yeah, anxiety is a part of your life, but it's not all of your life. And what happens if we try to enhance your sense of sacredness, your ability to see something sacred? And we did it in a variety of ways. One of the sessions we had pictures that might elicit, the kind of, awe and uplift. I love some of these pictures. It says something about what we may hold sacred. These faces, I mean, look at that face. Cup of coffee? And what we found in every session when we did monitoring levels of anxiety and sense of sacredness, every session, social anxiety dropped and the sense of sacredness increased. And it just illustrates, I think, how that's a resource that can be enhanced within the therapy process. Okay, let me move on then to a second fruit. Years ago, when I first began studying in this area, it became clear to me that while most people see their faith as a source of support in stressful times, for others, they encounter struggles with their faith, struggles that magnify the effects of the problems that they're coming to therapy. They may feel punished by God. They may feel a sense of divine abandonment or betrayal. They may question their most basic religious beliefs. They may be having fights and conflicts with family, friends, and institutions about spiritual matters. They may feel that they've failed to live up to their most core spiritual values and beliefs. They may be questioning if their life has any ultimate meaning at all. I resonate very strongly to these struggles in the people that I interviewed and worked with because they're so familiar to me as a Jew. Elie Wiesel, who was at Boston University, and unfortunately I never got a chance to meet him here. I always wanted to do that. I used to walk by his office, hoping that there might be a little crack in the office there, and I'd say, excuse me, Dr. Wiesel, could I come in and talk to you for a minute? I never had the nerve to do it. But survivor of the Holocaust and winner of the Nobel Prize, he once wrote, "What is Jewish history if not an endless quarrel with God?" And he wrote a play. He wrote a play here called The Trial of God, in which God stands accused and ultimately is convicted of a pogrom in Eastern Europe in which 100,000 Jews were murdered. Now, Wiesel reportedly based the play on the actual small trial of God that he witnessed in Auschwitz, where God was accused by a small group of concentration camp inmates of crimes against humanity, and God was found guilty. And so I've tried to read on this to make sure this is inaccurate, and I've read several accounts of this that say this was an accurate description of Wiesel's experience in Auschwitz. Now, the idea of putting God on trial may seem shocking, even blasphemous, but expressions of struggle such as this one are nothing new within Judaism. Sacred Jewish literature is replete with examples of exemplary figures engaged in passionate argument with God. Moses complains to God about his mistreatment of the Israelites. Jeremiah feels betrayed and deceived by God, and this is one of my favorite ones from Job. Job says, talking to God, "Does it seem good to you to oppress, to despise the work of your hands and favor the schemes of the wicked? Why do you hide your face and count me as your enemy? Will you frighten a wind-blown leaf and pursue dry chaff?" You know, Job is pissed. And he's sharing his anger with God. And I found myself quite at home with these struggles. And it's a very personal reason why I was so willing to kind of pursue this darker aspect of religious life, plucking it from the Jewish tree. Now, you may say, well, how is this a fruit? It sounds more like a weed. And I would say that from a Jewish perspective, again, spiritual struggles are not a sign of pathology or weakness. Questioning, disputing, debating, arguing, and struggling, they're built into the Jewish method of studying and learning. And they may be just as interwoven in the ways Jews deal with each other in the wider world. Struggle for Jews is a way of facing brokenness within oneself and trying to repair some of the damage. But as with sanctification, spiritual struggles grow on many trees. And it's not hard to find lots of examples of it across other faith traditions. Within Buddhism, before he became the Buddha, Siddhartha had to struggle with the demon Mara, who presents him with the world's greatest temptations, from lust to pride. In Jesus' final words on the cross, we hear Jesus struggling with feeling abandoned. My God, why hast thou forsaken me?" And there's no shortage of modern day accounts of spiritual struggle. I was giving a lecture on this to my undergraduate psych of religion class, and then I go back to my office and I get this email from an undergraduate in the class. She says, "I'm suffering, really suffering. My illness is tearing me down, and I'm angry at God for not rescuing me. I mean, really setting me free from my mental bondage. I've been dealing with these issues for 10 years now, and I'm only 24. I don't understand why he keeps lifting me up just to let me come crashing down again." Divine struggle. So I began shifting my focus in religious coping work to talk about, you used to talk about it as negative religious coping, but I never really liked that term, and I much prefer religious spiritual struggle, because negative religious coping is not really necessarily negative. It may be a pathway to growth. And struggle conveys that possibility that we struggle, we wrestle with the angels, and out of that we can grow, we can in fact be transformed. And we've been doing a number of studies on spiritual struggle. I'm working on a book on it right now with Julie Exline. And we've defined spiritual struggles as tensions, strains, and conflicts about sacred matters within oneself, with others, and with the supernatural. We have a nice measure of it as well. And our studies show that spiritual struggles are not uncommon. These are some different kinds of spiritual struggle. And if you take a look particularly at the lifetime prevalence of these struggles, including feeling angry with or punished by God, feeling the demonic or evil forces are at play in your life, feeling struggle with other people or institutions about sacred matters, feeling like you failed to live up to your higher values, religious doubts about the truth of religious claims, questions about the ultimate meaning and purpose of your life. We're talking about, for most, 3/4 of people have reported some of these struggles at some point in their life. So they're not unusual. These struggles involve deep questions about core beliefs, practices, connections, and values. They shake us to the core. And surprisingly, not surprisingly then, they're often a source of distress and disorientation. There's an example that I came across in a book by Joan Chittister, beautiful writer. The book is called Scarred by Struggle, Transformed by Hope. It looks like some of you have read it. Anyway, she's a sister in the Roman Catholic Church, and she'd won entrance into the prestigious Iowa State Writers' Workshop. And this had been her dream, to become a writer. But before she was about to leave, just a few days before, the head of her order told her without explanation that she couldn't attend the workshop. And here's how Chittister describes her ensuing spiritual struggle. I'll let you read it for yourself. You can just get the sense of how she was shaken to the core, how she was, it felt like she was drowning. This is the pain, the disorientation of a spiritual struggle. Now, Chittister isn't alone in her experience. We've been able to document robust correlations between spiritual struggle and distress and trouble. In one study, led by Hisham Abu Raya, national sample, religious struggle was tied to depression, anxiety, less life satisfaction, less happiness. This is in a national sample in the US. But these findings have been replicated in several other cultures and contexts across religious groups. Spiritual struggle is clearly, robustly tied to all kinds of potential problems. And I won't go into the details of these studies, but there we have them. These findings, and I guess an important clinical implication is when people come to us in therapy, many of them are struggling spiritually, and the struggles may be interwoven in the psychopathology or the problems they're presenting in their depression and their anxiety and the serious mental illness, marital conflicts. There may be, in fact, a spiritual struggle dimension interwoven in that needs to be addressed. Now, questions, though, can be raised about how complete this picture is. After all, don't we often tell our clients that their struggles are a potential source of growth? I mean, I think that's pretty common parlance in psychotherapy. Well, what's that? And we certainly know that that is described in the great religious dramas and narratives. From Moses to Jesus to Buddha Muhammad, we hear reports in the scripture of these powerful spiritual struggles. Spiritual struggle is, I think, in the essence of many of the greatest religious drama and narratives of how great religious figures worked through their struggle and came out the other end transformed. Those are the stories we hear. And I think we take them on and believe that that will also happen to us. And I think we can share that with our clients. Chittister describes her own struggle and finds it growthful. She writes, "Spiritual struggle gives life depth and vision, insight and understanding. It not only transforms us, it makes us transforming as well." I think that's really powerful. It doesn't only transform us, we become transforming. We transform the world in turn. So she's talking about this potential for growth and positive transformation through struggle. Well, what do the data show on this? Actually, the research doesn't show a consistent link between struggle and growth. If you look at it overall, it's very clear that people who struggle are in a great deal of pain. If people feel they're wrestling with God, if people feel they're in conflict with other people about spiritual issues, they're going to be showing a lot of distress. When we look at whether or not that distress is then tied to later reports of growth, it's not clear that that's the case. This, I think, is one of the reasons I love to do research, because it can be so surprising. The idea that suffering is going to inevitably build character, no. People suffer and they can be tremendously damaged. People suffer and they can be destroyed. Spiritual struggles can lead to decline that people don't recover from. That doesn't mean they can't. It just underscores the importance of what do you do with your struggles. I think that's such a powerful message to us as psychotherapists, because how we respond to people who are struggling and maybe help them move from decline and sense of brokenness to a trajectory of growth and transformation. That's something that we can do in treatment. And we can't take for granted that struggle then will automatically lead to growth. It takes hard work to transform following major crisis, major trauma, major tragedy. So here's some implications for therapy. Ask about spiritual struggles. How have your problems impacted you, not only psychologically, socially, and physically, but spiritually? That opens the door to spiritual struggles. Talk about them. People generally don't share their struggles because they can be a source of shame. They can lead to feelings of stigma or false reassurances. In therapy, you can talk about spiritual struggles as you would any other emotional, sensitive topic. Allow your client to engage with you in that topic and listen to them using all of our clinical skills. Normalize struggles. Recognize that struggles are a natural part of development. We struggle to grow. We struggle to change. We do that intellectually, emotionally, relationally. Without struggle, we wouldn't be able to grow. And finally, we can try to find ways to foster growth by broadening and deepening our spirituality. Along these lines, I've been really impressed with the work by Nicole Murray Swank, a former graduate student of mine, who worked with women who had been sexually abused. And she developed a program called Solace for the Soul. And the women she described they were all struggling spiritually, particularly with God. And they were struggling with their image of a male God that no longer was valid for them. Men in their lives were abusers, not loving figures. And so, but they still had a spiritual yearning. She helped these women, through her program, try to connect to the sacred in a somewhat different form. She offered them images, non-male images of God. That could be reassuring and offer solace and care. She had one meditation she had women do called Picture God as a Waterfall. And she has, and I've heard her do this, it's just beautiful. Picture God as a waterfall, pouring down cool, refreshing water, the waters of love, healing, restoration throughout your body. A cool, refreshing waterfall washing down over your head, your face, your shoulders, your neck, and so on. Renewing, refreshing, restoring. I love that. And women could relate to that image and visualize that image, broadening and deepening their own spiritual orientation. So these are two fruits that I've harvested from a Jewish tree, not exclusive to Jewish trees, but I think they've shown real value in spiritually integrated therapy. Let me now give an example of a fruit I harvested from another religious tradition and how that worked. Then I'll conclude. How much time do I have, Steve? About 10 minutes? Okay. The ability to draw on the richness of other traditions, I think, rests on a universalist understanding of religion, a non-exclusivist perspective. So if that's not where you're coming from, this isn't going to work very well for you. But my assumption is that every religion contains important truths. Every religion contains important truths, but that they come to us also through the voices and the hands of human beings who, great as they may be, are also frail, fallible, and flawed. So every religion, as a result, is limited. As a group, though, they may complement each other. Religious traditions may each bring distinctive fruits to the table. And let me give a personal example. For many years, I found myself frustrated in my clinical work with couples. The typical couple I saw came to my office with a litany of complaints about their partner, grudge collectors, and they had really long lists. And in listening to the grudges, my orientation was, I was trained, and it was the predominant orientation was communications oriented, to help people share their feelings so that they're being heard and understood. So I would have each partner share their complaints with the other clearly and have the other person listen and reflect to make sure they understood what their partner was saying. And we would go through the grudges. And it was immensely unhelpful. People would just get madder and madder. Now that they even understood and heard the complaints better, it didn't do anything for the quality of their relationship. They got angrier and angrier, and I was a very unsuccessful marital therapist. And one day, out of, I think, my own frustration with a grudge-collecting couple, more than any clinical wisdom, I asked them, have you ever thought about forgiving your partner? You know, letting some of this go? And it just stopped the conversation completely. They both just kind of looked at me, like with that vacant type of look, a stunned look. And they then each admitted that they'd never given that any thought at all. And it was a turning point for me, as I think it was for the couple. Now, the fact that I didn't know much about forgiveness, I think, in that context, comes, I think, from part in being Jewish. That in Judaism, forgiveness is seen as a relational construct, a relational process, that you don't forgive unless someone repents and makes amends. And your forgiveness is dependent on their making amends. But that also leaves you, as the person who is feeling wounded, continues to be dependent and controlled by the other person who may not have made amends. And that always, that really kind of, I think, kept forgiveness apart from my own clinical work. But around the time of this incident, I started reading and talking to one of my colleagues, Ev Worthington, about his work on forgiveness, and I was really impressed by it. And as we talked about it, he says, well, within Christianity, forgiveness is really more of a psychological process, and that you can forgive no matter what the other person does. And I thought, wow, that in some ways that's really freeing. And I started to work with that idea and found that it could be tremendously helpful for people. Started to think about forgiveness as a freeing kind of concept. And, looked into it, actually co-edited a book with Mike McCullough on forgiveness. Again, just because I need to learn about this, because I don't know about it from my tradition, and personally, I'm not very good at it. I could be a grudge collector too. And so I thought there were a lot of benefits for me studying this. And let me give you a quick example of a forgiveness, a case of forgiveness that I worked with. That I think worked pretty well. This was the case of Mary, a 30-year-old Roman Catholic woman who presented with anxiety and depression related to repeated failure in romantic relationships. She had hoped to marry early and have a large family, but she was continually disappointed in her relationships with men. And the older she got, the more she felt her dream fading away. As I got to know Mary, I learned that she would enter the relationship with very high hopes. Within a date or two, she would be imagining getting married to the guy she was dating, and started to think about what their kids would look like. Pretty desperate and hoping. But then the partner would do something foolish or dumb, and she would get angry and end the relationship until she felt her biological clock ticking again and re-engaging in the dating scene. Now, much of the time early in the sessions was devoted to her listing her complaints, her grudge collecting for these men who had hurt her. But early on in the process, I told Mary that I tried to stop that process. And I told her that although I'm Jewish myself, and she knew that I was Jewish, that I understand forgiveness was an important value in her tradition. And she said, yeah, she knew that as a Catholic she should forgive, but then she said, but I'm not good at it. But she was willing to take a closer look. And together we started reading about forgiveness, going over the steps of forgiveness, what the model looks like. And she began to open herself up to that possibility of working through conflicts in relationships. And the process really was transformational for her. She began dating again and was able to apply these insights into her new relationships and work through problems that arose. But this time in a spirit of forgiveness. And I still receive occasional cards from Mary, who's now married with 5 children. So adding the Christian fruit of forgiveness to my recipe of therapeutic ingredients, I think complemented rather than clashed with other fruits that I've harvested from Judaism. I think psychotherapy can be enhanced by many other fruit growing in still other religious fields. So let me move on to my conclusions. Spiritually integrated therapy is not just the application of current therapies to religious or spiritual clients. It really transforms the nature of therapy by integrating the spiritual dimension of our lives into the therapy process. Spiritually integrated therapy, as I think about it, is not a new alternative 3-letter acronym therapy. I resist SIP. No, this isn't SIP to fit with DBT, ACT, RET. No. Spiritually integrated therapy can and should be something that's integrated into any orientation, psychodynamic, cognitive behavioral, any approach to treatment should be spiritually integrated. At the very least, be spiritually sensitive. And here I've tried to illustrate how some of the trickiness that can come up in how do we integrate spirituality into treatment, particularly when we as therapists have our own orientations and beliefs about, and our clients can vary so much. So these are 3 challenges I'll leave you with. Should therapists help clients explore religious and spiritual resources that come from traditions other than the therapist's own? So as a Jewish therapist, do I have any right talking to a Christian client about forgiveness? I mean, it's a question. Would you, as Christian therapists, have any right working with Muslim clients and helping them take a look at the meaning of jihad in their tradition as a form of transformation? Would you feel, is that appropriate? Is it appropriate for therapists to help clients explore religious resources that lie outside the client's own tradition? This one may be even trickier. And let me just say a little bit about this. Should therapists help clients look into the fruit that come from other religious fields? Now, certainly, we are ethically obligated to respect the client's core beliefs and values, including their beliefs and values. And for clients deeply and exclusively committed to their, I'm sorry to do that to you, tradition, it's inappropriate, I think, to suggest to these clients that they explore other resources. You know, so if someone who's devoted to whatever tradition they have, and you say, well, I want you to try this Buddhist practice, I don't think that's appropriate, and you'll get some flack and feedback from it. Now, certainly therapists can encourage clients to learn more about resources within their own tradition that may be unaware of, like my case with Mary. She knew that she should forgive, but she didn't know how to do it, and it was congruent. It was egocentric for her to explore it. There are clients, though, who come to us, and I think this is more and more the case, who are uncommitted to a particular religious identity. They're uncommitted. Or they're actually interested in exploring other religious traditions. And I think in these cases, therapists can facilitate their spiritual quest. Doing so could pose a challenge if we're working in organizations that have an explicit religious mission. That can get really tricky. But I think it's important to remember that the primary obligation of the clinician is to foster mental health while remaining respectful of the client's own autonomy, own identity, and own values, even if those don't conform to those of the therapist, and even if they don't conform to those of the therapist's home institution. Again, this is tricky. And finally, can practitioners explore religious traditions other than their own in therapy and still remain committed to their own perspective? I know there's concerns about that in exploring other traditions, you may somehow weaken or invalidate your own faith. I can only tell you that I've been doing this for 40 years now, and it's only strengthened my own religious commitments. So each of these questions calls for self-reflection on us as therapists, a keen awareness of how our own approach to religion shapes our values, our worldview, and our clinical approach. And in this paper, I've tried to share some of my self-reflections. Now, self-awareness can be fostered in other ways too, writing a spiritual autobiography, consulting, collaborating with colleagues and from different traditions and advanced training in spiritually integrated therapy. But let me conclude this way. There are many religious fruit ripe for picking. By harvesting these fruit from our own traditions, as well as those growing in other religious orchards, we can enrich the lives of our clients, enrich ourselves as therapists, and enrich spiritually integrated therapy as a whole. Thank you.
Questions. If you'd like to ask a question, we have some folks with mics coming around. Please raise your hand and wait till they get there with a mic. Lovely.
So I'm wondering, with my spiritual struggle at the moment of being American, I'm wondering if you gave me some insight that I can take this struggle not just as a personal struggle, but also systemic or cultural, or, this, what appears to me, this lack of spiritual grounding that can propel us into a direction that many of us don't want to go. And how do we live with that without sinking into depression or running? Why not retire someplace else? And because the struggle seems to be the attachment that I have to my own country. And so, number one, thank you. There's a little light that went off that it's going to take days and weeks and months, and if not longer, for me to kind of find comfort in your words that I understood in my personal spiritual struggles, but I didn't quite think of taking it systemically and culturally, and it's offering me hope. So I don't know if I'm making myself clear, if you can add or subtract or whatever, but thank you.
Struggle is, I think, in some ways an opportunity, because when we struggle, our core values are often shaken. Our core assumptive world is shaken. The things that we believed were firm within our feet, beneath our feet, we realized it's not so firm, and that the core may not be as solid as we may have imagined. Maybe there are some little cracks or rifts beneath us, and that's very painful. And to be able to appreciate and accept the struggle without trying to deny it or suppress it is part of the challenge, to just be able to face it and say, well, it's being human, it's okay. And here's an opportunity for me. And the opportunity is, I think, the opportunity to re-envision your life dream, your life mission. The people who I've worked with who've struggled most successfully are people who've taken advantage of that opportunity. And for some of them, then they make sometimes some dramatic changes in their lives to realign their lives with new values, or values that were implicit but needed to be made more explicit. And so they become more socially engaged. They become more honest and understanding of themselves. I don't want to sentimentalize or romanticize that process, because I think transformation is the hardest thing in the world to do. And relatively few people, I think, actually make far-reaching life transformations in this conscious way we're talking about. But that's the possibility. That's the hope. That's what I think in therapy we can help people move towards as well. That possibility of struggling to greater wholeness and struggling in a growthful direction. So just some reactions. Great question, though. Thank you so much.
Do one more. Back there.
So Ken, in relation to the sacred, I think very powerful words about the power of the sacred. I wonder if you could say anything more about ways you've learned over the years to help people either find the sacred, or rediscover, or get closer to the sacred, moves like that.
Yeah. Yeah, it's been very, since I kind of moved in this direction, I've been very interested in that. How do you help people locate the sacred in their lives? It's not, I don't think it's something that we're very well, it's not something most people are conversant in, including therapists. We don't talk about it very much. And even if they are, there may be a gap in what your kind of expressed theology of what's sacred and what you really find sacred. To me, the key is the emotional power. The sacred may be many, many things. It is never boring. So if you're feeling bored, you are not in touch with something sacred. In therapy, I find then, and particularly with working with depressed people, where just a problem of affect, and any kind of affect is pretty serious. There's no affect there. Everything is flat. I look for subtle variation in mood. And it's like a little flicker of a flame. And if you sense that flicker, there's a little spark there, you start to blow on it. I remember talking to this guy, I've told this story before, but this guy was the most depressed guy I've ever worked with. And totally flat affect. And I was having a terrible time with him because he was so flat and lacked so much energy that I would find myself sleepy with him in the middle of the day. And I was worried I was going to fall asleep with him. So one day I asked him, I said, "Hey Joe, has there ever been a time when you felt really glad to be alive?" And it's kind of a question, implicit question to get at something sacred. And I didn't phrase it right, because he could have said, "No." Then I'd have been up the creek. But he said, "Well, there was that time I flew jets." You flew jets? This was the most unlikely jet pilot you would ever imagine. But he had, and when he started to talk about learning to fly jets, his energy picked up. He took off. And by the end, he was talking about the sheer joy of cutting through the clouds. And he said, "I can touch the face of God." I don't think he meant that in a theistic sense, but it didn't matter. He was getting in touch with something that was, I think, sacred to him, the notion of transcending the bounds of the earth and moving to a whole nother dimension. And we worked with him becoming a jet pilot again, and using that metaphor, that sacred metaphor, for how could he become a jet pilot at work? How could he become a jet pilot at home? How could he take those skills and understandings of being a competent, capable, assertive jet pilot and use them to energize his life? So it's not just the words, the language, the conversation. It's go for the affect. Go for the affect. Thank you.
Thank you, Kenneth.